Today we talk about the metaphysics of theism. The second part of our course is about the metaphysics of the philosophy of religion, and in particular, what we'll be focusing on is the metaphysics of the nature of God. What is God like? How are we supposed to think about God? So we begin that subject, as we talked about earlier, by thinking about three primary important approaches to the nature of God. The first option is creator theology. Genesis 1:1 can be taken as its identifying slogan. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Perhaps the primary fundamental feature about the nature of God is that God is the creator. A second option has become very popular among philosophers, especially in the 20th century, but we can trace the view to Anselm. This view is called perfect being theology. Whatever else is true about God, we should begin with the idea that the fundamental nature of God is to be a maximally perfect, greatest possible being. An alternative to these first two primary views about the nature of God is the worthiness of worship conception of God, that whatever else you say about God, the fundamental nature of God is to be a being who not only is to be worshipped, but deserves it, is worthy of it. Worship is mandatory with respect to God, on the assumption that there is one. Now, our first primary task will be to look at the credentials for perfect being theology. Most of the work that's been done in the last 100 years or so in philosophy of religion on the metaphysical side has been an investigation into the prospects for perfect being theology. It is by far the most popular view about the nature of God among philosophers. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now, when we look at this approach, a first thing to think about is what are the constraints on an adequate account of the nature of God? What should such an account sustain? What should it not sustain? Those are important questions in what we might call metatheology. Metatheology is reflection on what a theological theory should look like in order to be adequate. Now, some of these are purely logical constraints, like it shouldn't be inconsistent. That would be really bad. But what we're thinking about primarily are the constraints that govern an adequate conception of God. So what should creator theology look like if it's going to be better than the alternatives? What should perfect being theology sustain if it's going to win the competition for the best account of the nature of God? And the same for worthiness of worship theology. How do we assess these differing approaches to the nature of God? So I'm going to argue here for two initial assumptions to be made about what an adequate theology about the nature of God should look like. The first is monotheism. So let's talk a moment about why it would be a benefit to a theology to sustain monotheism. Now, an initial assumption that you might make, some people would make this, appeals to Occam's razor. If you don't need more than one God in the story, there's no reason to posit more than one God. I think I've read somewhere that the Unitarian Universalist Church has in their creed that there is one God at most. I think that's a rather humorous thing for a church to endorse, but it's an affirmation of the point that there's a presumption in favor of monotheism. Now, why might there be a presumption in favor of monotheism? One reason is Occam's razor. Here's another one. Call this the Socratic intuition. He thought it was beneath any decent conception of God for gods to behave in the way the members of the Greek pantheon behaved. Envy, strife, duplicity, procreating with human beings, it was a mess. So call this the disaster of the pantheon. Part of the reason for a presumption in favor of monotheism is the problem of the pantheon, the disaster of the pantheon. It's beneath the dignity of deity for it to be described in this way. So, how do you avoid that? Well, if you've got more than one God, you're going to be flirting with this problem, because as soon as you have more than one God, there's a question about the society of deities that you've posited. So you've now got a community of deities. Let's talk about how they interact with each other. If there are multiple deities, we need to investigate the issue of what happens when there's conflict. What happens when one deity prefers one outcome and another deity prefers a different outcome? As long as the outcomes are incompatible with each other, one of the two has to win. So how is this supposed to work? Presumably, you're not God if you keep losing to some other deity when there's conflict in that case. Part of the conception of God is the supreme being, the being in charge of everything. So one thing we can say about the presumption in favor of monotheism is you might want to distinguish between the concept of God, deity, and the concept of a divine being, something that is not part of the natural order, something that is supernatural but shouldn't be identified with God. So you could have divine beings such as angels, maybe demons, all sorts of other things. But you don't need to call them deities simply because they're divine beings. So suppose you do that, then what separates divine beings from deities? Presumably supremacy in some sense or other. Suppose then that we agree supremacy is essential to being a deity. Hence, if you're the deity that wins, if you're the divine being that wins all of the time, you have a claim to being a deity. If you're a divine being that loses, you don't have a claim. Once you go down this path, you can see part of the attraction for monotheism. How many supreme beings could there be? You are led to the position that one would be the ideal number. Now, maybe you can't get there. So maybe this presumption in favor of monotheism could be defeated by other kinds of arguments. Maybe, for example, there are conflicts between beings that are supreme in some way or other over all other beings, except for the small community, or maybe it's a larger community. And then sometimes one member of that community wins when there's conflicts, and other times a different being wins. I don't know why that would be true. I don't know how to explain what's going on. I don't know how to understand how one being could win sometimes and another being win other times without some story to tell about why that was happening or whatever. But it could be that that possibility can't be ruled out. Another possibility is perhaps among the beings that are candidates for deity, it's impossible that there's any kind of conflict among that community. In Christian theology, for example, there is a doctrine of the Trinity. God is one being in three persons. Now, there are philosophical issues to be addressed and talked about. We're not going to do that in this course because this is a generic philosophy of religion course, not a Christian philosophy course. But one of the answers, one of the ways of trying to preserve the coherence of the doctrine of the Trinity is called social Trinitarianism. This view comes very close to tritheism. In fact, one of the objections to it is you've got three individuals, so why isn't it three gods? Well, there are responses that can be put forward. Social Trinitarians try to avoid the charge of tritheism. And part of the story as to how they're supposed to avoid this is by arguing that all three members of the Trinity necessarily converge in attitude and will and thought. There is no distinction to be made. Hence, conflict is not a possibility in this social community, which is the Trinity. So perhaps one way to defend polytheism is to argue in the same way. Look, you've got a number of different gods, but don't worry about the problem of the pantheon because conflict isn't possible here. So the first presumption of metatheology is there's something to be said in favor of monotheistic accounts of the nature of God. So if you're comparing creator theology, perfect being theology, and worthiness of worship theology, which of these does a better job, has an easier time defending monotheism? The answer to that is creator theology seems to have an advantage here. Creator theology has as its fundamental commitment that God is the source and sustainer of all else, everything that's not God. Everything other than God is explained in terms of God. Now, that view might not be defensible, but notice how easy it is to explain monotheism given that starting point. Do you need more than one deity to explain everything else? Unless you can tell a story as to why you need more than one, let's just say, well, if one's enough, that's all you need. Now you get monotheism directly. Perfect being theology and worthiness of worship theology have a more difficult time on this score. Couldn't there be two perfect beings? Couldn't there be two beings maximally worthy of worship? Maybe not, but there's no obvious reason to appeal to as to why there couldn't be two beings that are both perfect or both maximally worthy of worship. So maybe creator theology here has a slight advantage, but we'd have to investigate more deeply, and maybe there's a way of defending monotheism from the other perspectives as well.